Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this, our 9th episode of North Carolina Community Class hosted by the North Carolina Museum of History. We created this series with the goal of educating and engaging all citizens. This is a reoccurring educational series aimed to explore the historical contributions of various individuals and communities across our state and nation. And we want to connect those histories to the social and political issues that have continued to impact our often underrepresented groups and communities here in our state. By bringing these historical figures and events to life, we hope that we will continue with the current education and growth and engagement of all of our community partners. My name is Crystal Regan, and I'm Education Section Chief here at the North Carolina Museum of History. And I am joined tonight by my illustrious co-host, Mr. Earl Imes, who is the Curator of African American and Communities here at the North Carolina Museum of History. Tonight's edition of Community Class is a Juneteenth special edition. And we are going to focus tonight on three extraordinary individuals who shaped liberation and freedom prior to emancipation here in the state of North Carolina. And what I'd like to do before we get started is cover just a few house rules for tonight's program. We're going to have our chat managed by Ms. Michelle Carr, an educator here at the North Carolina Museum of History. And we invite you to participate in our program tonight by commenting and asking questions. Some of the questions we will answer during the program, and others we will answer at the end of the program if time is permitting. We want to ask that you make sure your comments and your questions are respectful and relevant. And we will be sharing important information throughout the evening in our chat. If you are tweeting or you are on Instagram or on Facebook tonight, we invite you to talk about, to share, and to add your comments through social media and use the hashtags NC Community Class, Juneteenth, and North Carolina History. Next, I want to turn over to my colleague here, Mr. Earl Imes. And what we're going to do tonight is give a brief overview of the history of Juneteenth, make some connections, and then set you up pretty well for the conversation we're going to have tonight about three major North Carolina revolutionaries. Thank you for joining me tonight, Earl.
You're welcome. Thank you, Crystal. And thank y'all for joining us out in the virtual world. It is my pleasure to co-host this second annual event, the civic season, and revolutionaries and freedom seekers, and some of these people who we need to learn more about, who affected freedom for all.
Freedom for all, right? Absolutely.
And so Juneteenth is about freedom and freedom for all. And that freedom freedom for all begins in the midst of our American Civil War, 1861 through 1865. And in the middle of that war, it was very contentious. The Union, the Confederate, no one knew who would win. And it was getting dangerously close to losing the Union. And so President Lincoln needed a mechanism to change the course or the direction of the war. And in the middle of the war, September 1862, he introduced what's called the Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. And this is the first process of the freedom that culminates into Juneteenth in 1865 and the passage and the ratification of the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution that outlaws slavery and the curse of slavery over the entire land. And obviously, that emancipation freed our ancestors who were enslaved. And yet it's very important to know, Crystal, that freedom for all and freedom from the curse of slavery freed everyone, white, black, Indian, young, and old, from the curse of slavery. It freed our society. And here in North Carolina, we had been under the yoke of slavery for more than 200 years before the Civil War. And we needed to change that course. And that's what part of this celebration and commemoration is about, as a celebration of freedom. And so on the screen, you can see that process begins with the Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation.
There's a timeline there.
In September 1862. And that directly served notice to the Confederate States that those 11 states had 100 days to return to the Union, or people who were held in captivity or people who were held in slavery would be declared free. And so 100 days from that date in September, or that Battle of Antietam in Sharpsburg, Maryland, was on January 1st, 1863, or what we grew up in North Carolina calling First Night Watch, or Emancipation Day, as it is how we have historically celebrated it here in North Carolina and in South Carolina and Virginia and Georgia and other states, how we'll demonstrate before there's a Juneteenth on in June of 1865 in Texas. And then, of course, there's the Emancipation Proclamation that everyone knows about that goes into effect on January 1st, 1863. And then there's the actual end of the war with the surrender of Fort Fisher to the United States colored troops, and the United States House of Representatives finally relenting and voting on the passage of the 13th Amendment to send that out to the states. As the war was being won, we should say, in those last 3 months of the war between March, April, May, and June of 1865. And of course, the Civil War itself ended here in what is now Durham, North Carolina, at historic Bennett Place, with the largest surrender of Confederate forces in the history of the Civil War, right in what is now Durham. And effectively, Durham, North Carolina should celebrate Juneteenth in April, April of 1865, because that's when everyone was liberated from slavery. So that process is the process of freedom that we celebrate as Juneteenth and freedom for all.
So thank you for sharing that background. Let's jump to Galveston, Texas, because we want to make sure that our viewers understand that we're not co-opting the Texan Juneteenth, but that we want to do what a lot of historians say in terms of celebrating liberation across the United States and making that a part of this conglomeration of liberation celebration throughout the Atlantic, whether it be in the Caribbean, whether it be in South America, or even here in the continental United States, that all people who are the descendants of the enslaved want to celebrate those first rings of liberation. So can you talk a little bit about Galveston, Texas?
June 19th, 1865 is when Union General Gordon Granger arrived at the port of Galveston, Texas, with the news of the Emancipation Proclamation, and also with the help and the aid of United States colored troops who were there to enforce that freedom, right? So it's one thing to notify people of the freedom, but it didn't just happen in one day, Crystal. I mean, Juneteenth is not just one day, because that commission, and Texas is a very big state.
Yes.
And even with the internet, you can't get word across the whole state of Texas in one day.
Right.
So we certainly didn't do that June 19th, 1865. So that process continued. And it's important to note that that process, June 19th, 1865, was in the midst of the ratification of the 13th Amendment by the states. And the states, as you know, and we know, we need 3/4 of the states to sign off or to ratify an amendment before it becomes law. And this was the case in June of 1865. Congress ratified, as I mentioned, after the Battle of Fort Fisher in January 1865, and sent the amendment out to the states. And the states are in process of voting on this. At the same time, it's a military action to help convince other states to vote in favor of the amendment, because the Emancipation Proclamation would not hold water after the end of the Civil War, because in the words of President Abraham Lincoln, it was a fit and necessary war measure. But when the war is over, then the proclamation is null and void. And so we need an amendment to outlaw slavery permanently. And that is what the 13th Amendment accomplishes.
Amazing. On that note, let us look at just a quick clip explaining the connection between North Carolina, emancipation, and the important aspects of what we need to celebrate with Juneteenth.
Hello, my name is Earl Imes, and I'm at the historic state capitol in Raleigh, North Carolina, where the legislature in
December 1865 ratified the 13th Amendment outlawing slavery. Well, what is the 13th Amendment? Well, it outlaws slavery and involuntary servitude in the United States, except for as a form of a punishment for a crime whereof that party would have been duly convicted. That is the amendment which frees everyone from the curse of slavery. But it was not a foregone conclusion that the 13th Amendment would be passed. Back in 1865, there were only 36 states in the Union, and there were 11 former Confederate states. And for an amendment to become law in the United States Constitution requires 3/4 of the states to ratify that amendment. And that amendment was born out of the Smoky Battle of Fort Fisher in January 1865, when United States colored troops captured Fort Fisher below Wilmington, North Carolina. And the news of that fiery battle was telegraphed to the United States Capitol, and the United States House of Representatives voted to send that amendment out to the states. At that time, the Civil War was still raging. As the amendment was circulating through the United States, it got to the historic state capitol here in Raleigh. And the legislators in November convened to vote or not to ratify that 13th Amendment. As a former Confederate state, one of the conditions that the legislature required to begin debate on the amendment asked for the removal of the United States colored troops from the state of North Carolina. The legislature continued to debate, and here in North Carolina eventually did ratify the amendment on December 4th, 1865, known as Emancipation Day here in North Carolina. And 2 days later, our sister state out in Georgia ratified the amendment on December 6th, becoming the 27th state out of 36 in the Union, or in other words, the 3/4 of the states that are required to ratify the amendment for it to become law and outlaw the scourge of slavery, not only in North Carolina, but in the United States and all its territories subject to its jurisdiction.
What an amazing history. Thank you for sharing that, Earl.
You're welcome.
So what we want to do tonight, everyone, is we want to answer just 2 questions, but we want to do it through the lives of 3 major North Carolina revolutionaries. And those questions are, what role did Black North Carolinians play in outlawing or opposing slavery prior to the 13th Amendment? Because we're going to dive back a little deeper. The second question, what agency was demonstrated by them that ultimately led to freedom for all? So tonight we are going to focus on 3 major revolutionaries, liberators here in North Carolina that some of you may be familiar with and some of you may not be. We're grateful for all of you who have joined tonight, who may be teachers, who may be citizens, who may be retirees, who just want to learn more about North Carolinians, and particularly African-American North Carolinians, who have contributed, given their lives, and set the stage for liberation, because that is an ongoing struggle. And so tonight we're going to talk about 3, David Walker, Harriet Jacobs, and Abraham Galloway. So we'll start tonight with David Walker, probably the least familiar revolutionary because of the intensity, right? The intensity of his appeal to the colored citizens of the world. A pamphlet that was written in, I believe, 1829.
That's correct. And published in 1830.
And published in 1830 that will resonate around the world. David Walker, one of what many call one of the original Pan-Africanists, born right here in Wilmington, North Carolina. Earl, can you talk a little bit more about David Walker?
Yes, thank you. David Walker is one of my favorite subjects, people in history. He published the first abolitionist pamphlet, his appeal in 4 articles, you see on the screen, namely aimed at the, quote, colored citizens of the world. And that is largely because of the state of degradation and subhumanity that a lot of African Americans had begun to accept as a reality, and a lot of people who were not African Americans were beginning to actually enforce
Mhm.
in social customs and in law.
Mhm.
And by the 1820s, it had become so degradative and just subhuman that someone like David Walker, a literate, educated person, just couldn't stand it anymore. So he pours from his soul in a cry to all America, to the Christian people of America, and to the world, and pointedly to the people of color. And so the first abolitionist pamphlet is David Walker's appeal, which it becomes a firestone. It just unlocks a Pandora's box,
Mhm.
because immediately it sends shock waves throughout not only North Carolina, but throughout the South, throughout the world. Because this type of language, this type of direct in your face
Mhm.
had rarely been seen in literature before then.
Mhm.
And also the matter of fact and the primary source nature of it could not be refuted, because it was an eyewitness account, according to David Walker and his observations of slavery in Wilmington and in Charleston, South Carolina, in particular. And so his background, he is a writer for the first, the Liberator, the first
Mhm.
African-American newspaper, with Reverend Allen and the
Mhm.
AME Church.
Mhm. Richard Allen.
Richard
Mhm.
Allen, exactly. And they publish abolitionist pamphlets in the form of a newspaper in the 1820s,
Mhm.
but it doesn't gain much traction because of the anti-abolitionist sentiment
Mhm.
that pervaded not only the South, but the country
Mhm.
at that time. And so this publication was actually read by the governor and declared a sedition, and we'll go into that later into the program.
So that kind of sets the stage for David Walker. Another thing we should mention, Earl mentioned that the condition of enslaved people in the early 1800s was that slave owners were accepting that. Of course, the enslaved people never accepted their condition. They were trying to figure out ways to survive.
Well, the old timey term is how to go along, get along,
Go along, get
go
along.
along.
That's
To
right.
get along, and to minimize infliction.
That's right. Or the separation of families.
And the separation of families. So all types of measures of ameliorating the ferocity of slavery, enslaved African-American ancestors endured in order to live and survive and get us to this point
Mhm.
in our American history where we can actually talk about this,
Mhm.
because they couldn't even talk about
Couldn't
that back
talk
then,
about
Chris.
it. And we see that in the WPA workshops, and even though people were censored, we know that. But we see that in the memoirs of enslaved people, where they say, my folks don't want me to talk about slavery. It was too painful, too traumatic. But when we look at David Walker, I think it's important to know he was born in the eastern part of North Carolina, in what we now call Wilmington, between somewhere 1785 to 97. We don't have those particular records, but we know he was born shortly after the Revolutionary War.
That's right.
And we know that he was born to a free Black woman in that particular region of North Carolina, and possibly an enslaved father.
Possibly or possibly not. And this is where more scholarship and research is required in understanding David Walker, because the lower Cape Fear region of North Carolina produced a lot of Black Revolutionary War patriots,
right?
People who earned citizenship helping to found this country. And yet the founding of the country literally took the honor of those Black and African-American and people of color who served as patriots, took that away from them, and effectively made it impossible with the 1792 Militia Act for African-Americans to be in the United States Army at the founding of the
Our nation.
And so this is what the Emancipation Proclamation overturns.
That's right.
And allows for the creation of United States colored troops we'll get to. But one quick thing I wanted to point out, This book is written in 1829, published in 1830, and is written on the heels of one of the most significant Supreme Court rulings in the history of North Carolina
Mhm.
and in the country, and that is the Thomas Ruffin ruling, the Thomas Mann versus the state versus Mann,
Mhm.
which is essentially a ruling that said that, quote, a black man has no right that a white man is bound to respect. And that
Right.
set the stage for the mores and the
Mhm.
social customs.
That we attribute to Dred Scott.
Right, but Dred Scott decision literally grew out of this.
On the back of that.
On the back of this is
That's right.
1828 ruling, North Carolina
Mhm.
Supreme Court
Mhm.
Chief Justice Thomas Ruffin
Mhm.
issued this ruling. And so in many ways, David Walker's appeal is a reaction to that,
Yes.
because you have a ratchet up
Mhm.
in the horrid treatment of
Mm-hmm.
African Americans after this ruling.
Right. And I think we should also mention that we're looking at 1829 and 1830, and we know what happens in 1831.
Well, tell us what happens in 1830.
Well, we know we're looking at
Nat
a
Turner's
major
rebellion.
rebellion.
Yeah,
Nat Turner, and that is Virginia, our sister state.
just
of
over the
course.
state line.
Just over.
Southampton County, Virginia is just over the
Southampton
line
County.
from Northampton County, North Carolina.
But we want to jump back to David Walker. So we know, so Earl is giving this background about David Walker. We know he has his early years in what is now Wilmington. We know he makes his way to Charleston. And we know Charleston is a refuge for the AME Church. Most people think about Richard Allen, and they think about Boston, and they think about the New England and northern states. But Charleston has a substantial free Black community at this time. We know that David Walker makes his way to Charleston. Even though he's amongst these free Blacks, we know Charleston is also one of the major ports for the African slave trade during the early 1800s. And he's seeing even more horrid sort of things happening. And then makes his way to Boston.
Well, you've been really nice. You called it the slave trade, and it really was a
I'm not
trade in
being
human
nice.
trafficking.
I'm not being nice.
It was
A chattel slave trade.
it was a trade in human trafficking is what it was.
Yes,
And historically, and this is why we have Juneteenth,
Mhm.
those weren't slaves on those ships. Those were people.
People, enslaved people.
And they were turned into slaves
Mhm.
as part of these laws and customs that we're talking about.
Mhm.
And so you're right, David Walker was an eyewitness
To all of this.
to all of this. And you're talking about at a time when supposedly the ban on transatlantic slave
Was supposed to
trade
be over.
in 1809, but we all know that that just put a premium on human
Mhm.
beings being trafficked from the continent in
Mhm.
Africa to the New World. That just put a higher price on people's head and body.
Yes. And we know that trade continued for decades,
Literally through the end of the Civil War.
through the end of the Civil War, in which enslaved people were brought illegally to the United States. So we want to keep moving to this. So we know that the appeal to the colored citizens of the world, one of the earliest known,
The first known abolitionist pamphlet.
but I'm getting to the Pan-Africanist part.
Yes.
Pan-Africanist, sort of written documents that we could label as such. And I'm sure there were many prior to that. But David Walker is going to have this foundation for many people. We think of the Garveys and the Stokely Carmichaels and
Marcus Garvey.
and all of that, all through post-Reconstruction and into the modern civil rights movement. But all of these revolutionaries and leaders hearkened back to David Walker
That's right.
and what he had to say about the unification and the humanity. I think it's important to note too that David Walker was a fervent Christian, and that he talked a lot about the Old Testament sort of principles that people who were so-called Christians should live by. And he believed in Old Testament retribution.
That's right. And New Testament gospel.
Yes.
Because he quite frankly alludes quite a bit. And here's my copy, David
Mhm.
Walker's appeal. You can see it's really
Mhm.
dog-eared, been going through a lot of mileage here, but get your own copy. This is my copy.
Mhm.
But David Walker's appeal, it's revolutionized the way that we look at rhetoric,
Mhm,
and it created what we called a backlash,
mhm.
which we'll talk about. But here's an excerpt on the screen of one of the pages that I wanted to share with you. And it's a quote directly from the book relating to with his observations in the South. Quote, I have known tyrants and usurpers of human liberty to take their fellow creatures, the colored people, and beat them until they could scarcely leave life in them. And what for? And why they say, Crystal, quote, the Black Devils had the audacity to make prayers and supplications to the God who made them.
Mhm.
Yes, I have known small collections of colored people to have convened together for no other purpose than to worship God Almighty. When tyrants, calling themselves slave patrols, would also convene and wait almost in breathless silence for the poor colored people to commence singing and praying to the Lord our God. The wretches would burst in upon them as they would and drag them out and commence beating them as they would beat a rattlesnake. Many of whom they would beat so unmercifully that they would hardly be able to crawl for weeks or even months.
And I think that aspect of the violence that permeated.
If you can go back
American-
to that screen too, I'm sorry, to show that image there too. And I'm sorry to interrupt you, Crystal, but that image is an original image that I located in the State Archives
Mhm.
through the pine woods at night to get to the Oak Grove. How many Oak Grove churches do we have?
Quite a few.
That's what it comes from, is that we usually would have to steal ourselves away deep into the forest
Mhm.
where you're beyond the slave patrols and the slave dogs, the
That's right.
bloodhounds that were trained to eat you if they found you.
Mhm.
You had to go deep into the forest to pray and worship God. And if you were caught, you could be eaten by slave dogs or
Mhm.
bloodhounds, beaten to death or killed. And God help you if your slaveholder had an insurance policy on you,
Absolutely.
they will be redeemed.
And that is why it's important to remember that these weren't, this wasn't a situation that people accepted. It was a matter of survival, right?
It was.
It's a matter of survival. So we know that this was published in early 1830. And in the same year, David Walker's appeal was declared sedition in North Carolina, as you mentioned earlier, and throughout the South, and bounties were placed on Walker's head. And before we transition to the next revolutionary, I think it's important to remember that Walker's appeal was smuggled and transferred throughout the Eastern Seaboard, primarily amongst Black sailors.
Well, that and through the grapevine.
And through the grapevine.
So David Walker was a
Yes.
longshoreman
Mhm.
or someone who worked on the docks in
Mhm.
Wilmington. He was a tailor and he was a dealer in clothes.
That's right.
And what he would do would be something along the line of, he would write his pamphlet.
Mhm.
It would go on the inside of a gentleman's coat.
Mhm.
A gentleman would get a new piece of fine clothing from David Walker and
Mhm.
pop it open, and there is the appeal.
Mhm.
And so the appeal was found circulating among Black citizens in North Carolina
Mhm.
when the governor of North Carolina at that time, a man named Mumford Stokes, got a copy and read it as the first item of business for the January to March 1830 session in the North Carolina legislature.
And that's when we get to the backlash regarding David Walker's appeal. And it's important to note that his appeal was transferred amongst the various classes of African Americans, if you will, at that time, free folks in the North, sailors in the Southeast, sailors who are ripping open their jackets to smuggle that appeal in their jackets and sewing it back up so that it wouldn't fall out,
That's right.
and transporting that up. So we're looking at North Carolina's Eastern Seaboard. We're looking at Charleston. We're looking at Savannah. We're looking at New Orleans,
Don't forget the original Washington and North Carolina.
Richmond. We're looking at
Newbern, all
Newbern,
these seaport towns,
Edenton.
Edenton, yes.
And this is a North Carolinian who is setting the stage and leading the way for that. And we don't want to forget David Walker.
That's right.
So now we've talked about that. We want to talk about another revolutionary.
Well, I think we're going to briefly about the backlash.
Well, okay, let's talk about the governor
Okay,
real quick.
just quickly.
And let's talk about, we talked about Nat Turner's rebellion, of course, which some people may be familiar with. But I'm glad you mentioned that, because we need to talk about Montford. Because David Walker's appeal, people tend to associate the violent backlash. But we need to talk about policy and legislature and political leaders who put their foot down in order to stamp out this sort of abolitionist rhetoric. So let's jump to
Well,
that.
it's important to know, as you mentioned, there's a sizable population of free people of color who never settled for the rigors of slavery and the laws and customs. And so this freedom pamphlet energizes people.
Mhm.
Like you say, or Marvin Gaye would say, they heard it through the grapevine. Back in those days, not everyone could read. And so you would have people, they would read it and it would be carried orally in oral history.
Let's talk about this governor.
Yes. So Mumford Stokes is the governor of North Carolina, and he gains a copy of David Walker's appeal, which had been found circulating among the people of color in the state. And among the laws that were passed, or the slave codes, Crystal is what we call them, is a law that it is enacted that free persons should teach, it is enacted that no free person should teach any enslaved or to read or write, save the use of figures accepted, to give them any book or pamphlet. And that is a direct reference to the appeal, not by name. So other restrictive laws and resolutions in that January 1830, March 1830 session quickly followed, like free and enslaved African Americans no longer were allowed to marry or cohabit.
Mhm.
This had not been a law before then.
Mhm.
And so it sets in that custom.
Mhm.
And even with permission, with the penalty for doing so being 39 back lashes,
Mhm.
or lashes on the back. So in other words, this is the legal remedy, a backlash,
Mhm.
or 39 backlashes. But today we figuratively call it a backlash
Mhm.
when there's a reaction to progressive movements like David Walker's appeal.
Mhm. Words are not coincidental, right? They
They
have
come
meaning.
from the laws and the customs and the mores and the folkways passed down our customs and our
Absolutely.
languages. Yes.
Absolutely. So let's move to one of our next freedom seekers or revolutionaries, and that is Harriet Jacobs of Edenton, North Carolina. And I think for those of us who are somewhat familiar with Harriet Jacobs and her story, we think about her hiding in her grandmother's garret, or what some of us would call an attic.
That's
right?
what we call it today. Yeah.
That's what we would call it today. Very small, cramped,
like this.
uninsulated. There was no insulation then.
On a day like today, 105-degree heat index.
Stifling. And to keep in mind, in the wintertime, in other parts of the year, full of rodents. She talked about in her memoir that her bed was full of rats and mice.
And the rat snakes that chase the rats.
That's right.
Yes.
So let's talk a little bit about Harriet Jacobs. Born in Edenton, North Carolina, the granddaughter of a free businesswoman in Edenton, North Carolina, by the name of Molly Horniblow, right? And she was someone who had witnessed and experienced the Revolutionary War, had dealt with the separation of her family during the Revolutionary War, had free family members, but then had to deal with the repercussions of the revolution. And I think it's important to know that many African Americans, of course, the revolution, we think about freedom and emancipation and liberation, but slavery took a deeper entrenchment, right? Deeper hold
After the American
Revolution.
Yes.
And the Jacobs and Hornibo family, they were not exceptions.
Well,
And so they had to deal with the blowback of the revolution. And of course, Harriet Jacobs and her father and her siblings, of course, had to deal with enslavement, even though they had a free grandmother who had a bakery, had her own home in Edenton, North Carolina. So her story kind of outlines this dichotomy of enslavement and freedom within families. And it's a reminder that most free Black people were not separated
that is correct.
from slavery,
That is correct.
particularly in North Carolina.
Well, we can't do enough research and justice for Harriet Jacobs.
Mhm.
And just as her vital stats indicate, her grandmother had a certain level of freedom and enterprise
Mhm.
at the Revolutionary War. She's part of that socio-economy of people of color,
Mhm.
particularly in North Carolina, who contribute to the revolution.
Right.
And it's worth researching. I would not be surprised if she has ancestors directly fighting in the Revolutionary War against the British to gain these types of privileges
Mhm.
at the outset of America. But again, when the 1792 Militia Act and then 1794 Patent on Cotton Gin,
Mhm.
it became hell on earth for all African Americans, because even free people, there are even instances of Revolutionary War veterans in North Carolina literally being captured
Mhm.
and sold into slavery.
Absolutely.
What a horror story.
And we know that about Jacob's family, that they
Yes.
were escaping that they were concerned about that, but made their way from the South into Edenton, North Carolina.
Yes.
So Jacob's, her lineage is another conversation. I would think we would look at incidents in the life of a slave girl written with the pseudonym Linda Brent.
Yes.
But we also know that there's been quite a bit of research done on Jacob's family. We know she was born around 1813, was formerly enslaved, like many enslaved Black women, enslaved women, subjected to sexual assault, and decided that she was going to choose her own lover. And that is in the record, because she did not want to be subjected to the man who owned her, and ended up having two children prior to going to New York and escaping slavery. Her owner threatened to sell her children, and then she ends up hiding in her grandmother's garret and having to separate herself from her own children. In her memoir, she talks about, or incidents, she talks about watching her children play while she got up during the day sometimes and stretched her legs from that garret to watch her children play. And she did that for 7 years. And then she makes her way to New York. And that we could do another segment on how she is able to escape
The Underground Railroad.
and make her way
Yes.
to New York. So she does that. She hides out for 7 years. People think she's dead. They think she's run away. There are all sorts of stories that are being spread out throughout the community. And after escaping slavery, she publishes her biography, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, 1861. And it becomes one of the most powerful abolitionist publications, and a major factor leading to the Civil War. So we're looking at close to 20 to 30 years after an appeal.
Yes. Yes.
This abolitionist sort of publications and writings are still being pushed, even in the midst of the most violent, the most violent components, or the most violent period of American slavery. We still see revolutionaries and abolitionists writing and smuggling and running and rebelling. And it's important to know, and resisting.
Yes, and it's important to note, Crystal, that the experience that Harriet Jacobs talks about is not an anomaly.
It's not.
It is
No.
unfortunately the norm for too many of our aunts, grandmothers, sisters, daughters.
Mhm.
Can't imagine having to, as a father, having to endure the type of slavery that we tolerated in
Mhm.
this country and North Carolina
Mhm.
when it comes to your children.
Comes to your children.
Can't imagine your daughter and you have no power at all to stop assaults of that nature from anyone.
Mhm.
And you have no right that a white man is bound
Bound
to
to
respect.
respect. And we're looking at that with fathers and mothers and grandparents. Of course, she's close with her grandmother. She knows her family, her father. She talks about him at length, and I believe in her memoir. So we're talking about a woman who runs away, chooses to have children, you know, because she's trying to protect herself from someone else. And family is at the core of her memoir.
That's right.
And it's important to know for those of you who are with us tonight, who are able to visit the the New York Historical Society. They recently had a Black Dolls exhibit. And in that Black Dolls exhibit are the dolls that were fashioned and created by Harriet Jacobs once she reached freedom. She was able to work for a New York family and made dolls for the young girls that she was babysitting.
Wait a minute, I gotta make a note because we gotta borrow those artifacts.
Yeah, we may have to
Gotta
borrow them.
bring those to North Carolina.
And we are able to see the dolls that she sewed together in her liberation. In her liberation.
What a powerful testimony
That's right.
that is.
And she was with us until 1897. Again, wrote with the name Linda Brent. So that is Harriet Jacobs. Of course, there's a whole lot more we could talk about with Harriet Jacobs, but when we're looking at time, we want to move to the next
But before we leave Harriet Jacobs, she left those primary sources for us.
She did.
Because as a curator, archivist, we'd be remiss as educators not to encourage our viewers and listeners to think about primary sources
Mhm.
that they can gather and bring to the public attention so that we can help bring more of this history and stories out. So the dolls and artifacts, wonderful primary sources, in addition to her autobiography.
Right. And so incidents, of course, written in first person under the pseudonym Linda Brent. We invite everyone to read that, ponder, think about it, and put yourself in her shoes.
And she even wrote pseudonyms for the slaveholders because at that time there was a fugitive slave law that if they identified her or the slaveholders, there was a bounty likely on her head for her life.
And she stayed in fear.
Right, because we know
ultimately she left New York and went to Canada for a while.
Well, and of course, going back to David Walker, we know that his publication was declared sedition and by at least seven states in the Union. And a bounty was placed on his head and he mysteriously dies.
He mysteriously
disappears in June 1830.
Well, of course, it could have been tuberculosis, diphtheria. It could have been a number of things.
Or it could have been slave catchers.
Well, he was no longer with us.
Right.
But he gave us what he gave us in a short amount of time.
Left us
and we know that Harriet Jacobs, of course, was warned. She knew that the daughter of her previous owner was looking for her.
That's right.
And so she ultimately ended up having to go to Canada. And again, that is not a unique story for those folks who ran away. But we want to move on because the time is so good and time is running short. Let's talk about Abraham Galloway.
My favorite Civil War spy. Yes, Abraham Galloway was born enslaved in Wilmington, North Carolina. His mother, according to North Carolina law, his mother in a state of slavery, he's born in a state of slavery, even though his father is an Irish seaman. And so this is how the laws form customs that help to grade the lot of the female and almost keep slavery in perpetuity through a maternal cycle like that. So Abraham Galloway was born enslaved to a woman of African descent, an Irish seaman. And he paid $15 a month rent to his slaveholders working as a carpenter. This is important to note is that many slaveholders, many people who were enslaved didn't work in cotton fields or turpentine orchards or peanut fields. They actually were hired out and they were rented out. And in a perverse type of way, it lent incentive to individuals like Galloway to hire himself out. So $15 a month, he's probably getting 50 cents or $1 of that, and the slaveholders getting the overwhelming majority. And in a perverse way, that's how those quit rents, or what they were called, operated on people who were enslaved. You had a price on your head, literally,
Mhm.
where you were required to produce a certain rent. So he's producing 15 a month of rent to a slaveholder in Wilmington before seeking freedom. You know, he's not escaping slavery, he's seeking freedom. And in a turpentine barrel, no less. So, you know, if you smell turpentine before, imagine standing in a turpentine barrel for a couple, 2 or 3 weeks in a boat from Wilmington to Philadelphia.
Mhm.
I wouldn't try that at home. So during the Civil War, Abraham Galloway was a spy who met with Abraham Lincoln to recruit the United States colored troops.
Mhm.
After the Emancipation Proclamation, as I mentioned, it was declared a fit and necessary war measure. And so it changed the trajectory of the war, and it allowed for the enrollment for the first time in American history under the American flag,
Mhm.
African Americans in the United States Army. Albeit it was a segregated army that remained segregated for the next 100 years. That's another whole story.
Another story.
But
Yes.
but he insisted that the United States colored troops be paid equally and learn to read and write as part of their training,
Mhm.
because he knew that these men would be leaders in what we now call the Reconstruction and into the 20th century.
Mhm. Now,
And he was among the first elected African-American politicians elected to the 1868 Constitution Convention as a delegate to New Hanover County, where Wilmington, North Carolina is located.
so we see the coast, we see Wilmington again. But before we move on, can you talk a little bit about his adventures in Haiti and other places?
Well, he is a freedom seeker. He is a world traveler. He is observing a lot of the customs, particularly in Haiti, because Haiti is the first free Black country,
Republic. Mhm.
republic
In the Western
in the
Hemisphere.
New World, in the Western Hemisphere.
Mhm.
And Haiti directly lends itself to our American Revolution.
Mhm.
And so a lot of the spirit of that, he brings out of Haiti into North Carolina, that determination for freedom,
Mhm.
literally passed down from Toussaint Louverture and Henry Cresty.
And that is something I want to interject is important regarding Juneteenth, is that we're talking about liberation or freedom for all. And that even when those Texans found out in 1865 that they had been liberated, that this is a trajectory or a story that people of African descent are continuing to build on, whether it's 1801, 1804, or whether it's 1865, or in parts of, I think about Brazil and parts of South America,
Well,
even later.
You talk about Haiti, part of this Juneteenth movement during the
Mhm.
Civil War leading to Galveston Juneteenth, June 1865.
Mhm.
It was in 1864 that the United States government finally recognized Haiti as a free and independent country.
Mhm.
And it
That's
was
60 years later.
60 years after 1804. And it's a
Mhm.
direct result of the heroism
Mhm.
of the United States colored troops
The United States
during
Code
the
Troops.
Civil War.
That's exactly right.
Yes.
And Haiti and the reparations they are paying to their former enslavers is at the height of the news cycle, right? The fact that they are still paying the French government for enslaving them. That's another,
That's still effectively a colony.
still effectively a colony,
Yes.
but set the stage for so many across the globe.
That's right.
In terms of liberation.
That's right.
We want to wrap up Abraham Galloway. So, Earl, if you jump back to it, so we know Abraham Galloway made his way, he crisscrossed the Caribbean, right?
Yes.
He is someone who is aware of the Haitian Revolution. He is someone who, again, has Pan-Africanist ideology, and is wanting to bring that ideology back to his home state and serve and lead and be a leader for African Americans. Talk a little bit more about Galloway post-Civil War.
A real revolutionary. He was so progressive, Crystal, that he insisted on women voting at the end of the Civil War. Imagine that.
I can imagine it. You sitting
I
there
can
like
too.
this is just shocking.
But then we're acting in Civil War language, right?
Yes.
So he was considered a radical
Mhm,
for insisting that women should vote.
mhm,
He was considered a radical for insisting that for 200 years before the Civil War, these people who worked in the plantations in Wilmington or who had to rent themselves out in New Bern
mhm,
finally get paid.
mhm,
Maybe they could get compensated for their labor and maybe they can get part of the land
mhm,
that they actually used to work on.
mhm,
He was considered radical
mhm.
and a danger. And in order for backlash, so in 1868, as I mentioned, he was elected as a delegate to the 1868 Constitution Convention. After the Civil War, our state, like the other 11 former Confederate states, the other 10 Confederate states, 11 includes North Carolina,
Right.
were required to draw a new constitution
Mhm.
because the old constitutions mandated slavery.
That's right.
And so the 1868, he was one of the main framers
Mhm,
of this new advanced constitution that we still use in North Carolina that guarantees us to the privilege of education, a
mhm,
mandate, for an example, that exceeds
mhm.
the federal constitution.
That's
This is
right.
how forward thinking he was. And so he was elected later following the 68 convention to a single term representing New Hanover County,
Mhm,
which at that time included Pender County. Pender County was later gerrymandered away from New Hanover to siphon off the black vote. And he was partly he was the response. He was the cause of that, I should say. And the backlash was gerrymandering. But he died suddenly and under mysterious circumstances in 1870. And the authorities who investigated his death put him in the ground so fast, Crystal, that his wife and children did not have time to travel from New Bern to Wilmington.
Shameful.
But 6,000 other mourners
We're there.
through the grapevine heard word of the death of the great Abraham Galloway,
Galloway.
the state senator, Abraham Galloway, and they were able in that small window of time
Mhm.
assemble for the largest funeral, or in our community, we call it homegoing,
Homegoing.
for the largest homegoing in North Carolina history up to that point.
Mhm,
So this is how revered he was
mhm,
as a human being and for what he left us
mhm.
insofar as looking forward in a progressive society and bringing everyone, freedom for all to everyone
Mhm.
coming out of the shackles of slavery.
And I want to remind everybody to look at our chat because we are putting some information in that chat regarding literature and various periodicals and things that you can read to learn more about these revolutionaries. And yes, Earl mentioned that Abraham Galloway was progressive in thinking about liberation, true liberator, in terms of liberation when we say freedom for all.
Freedom for all.
But I think it's important to note that while some of us may think that is extremely progressive in terms of his ideas about the role in which women should play, that is indicative of the status of the enslaved community, where you have women and men working equally for liberation in various parts of the slave community. So
Equality is a mandate during
it is a
slavery.
mandate,
And
absolutely.
in order to go along and get along and make things happen.
Mhm,
And brandishing literally a new people on the globe who's holding America to those ideals
that's right.
that we profess in that Constitution.
Mhm,
It's been the most debased population of Americans who have in fact insisted on America to hold those ideals that are enshrined in that United States Constitution.
You are absolutely right. And every time the enslaved and the descendants of the enslaved pushed the limit, everyone rose above. Everyone.
And
And so we think about civil rights movement, and I'm talking, when I say the civil rights movement, I'm talking about the long civil rights movement, not the modern civil
because the
rights
first civil
movement.
rights bill was 1866.
Right, or even before that, we see
Right.
a Mum Bet in Massachusetts saying, hey, this is what the Revolutionary War document said. She hired a lawyer. and said, I should be liberated. So we're seeing this long civil rights movement from our founding, right?
That's right.
And people saying this is not just should not just benefit me, this should benefit all so-called Americans.
That's right. Freedom for all.
Freedom from all. So we've seen that from the very beginning, in which the wave, what is it, all boats rise, whatever that thing is.
Yeah.
But
Rising tide floats all boats.
yeah.
Yes.
Whatever that is. But we've seen that with the long civil rights movement, in which African Americans were thinking about themselves, their families, and anyone else who would dare to call themselves an American. And all of that legislation, all of that resistance, all of that rebellion was designed to benefit all.
That's right. And don't forget the backlash too, because there's an ebb and flow to that. In 1866, that civil rights bill also produced a filibuster.
Right.
And so, that's something that we're talking about even to this day. Is it seems that when the question of freedom for all comes up, there's a filibuster backlash.
Absolutely.
And so we've had in United States history over 30 filibusters, and the overwhelming majority are related to civil rights bills and lynching bills.
Mhm. And we
And
can
voting-
talk about,
and voting bills.
and we can talk about how long it took to get an anti-lynching bill.
Yes,
Right.
the
to
Emmett Till
just
anti-lynching
put
bill
on the
is
books.
125 years after Congressman George Henry White introduced a lynching bill in the 1890s in the United States.
And we're going to talk about him in
Yes.
just a moment.
Yes.
So we've talked about David Walker, Abraham Galloway, David Walker, Harriet Jacobs, Abraham Galloway. And what I like to do now is just for a moment, can you talk about Emancipation Day?
Yes.
So before we move into that, these are three, and we've done a quick, very quick sort of overview of who these individuals were, what they contributed, and the fact that they were from North Carolina. And again, I would ask everyone to do a little bit of digging, do the reading and do the research to find out more about the lives of these revolutionaries and all the work that they did towards liberation.
Primary sources.
Yes.
This is what we, as a museum of history, we
Mhm.
deal in artifacts
Mhm.
that tell these stories that come with a provenance that we get from individuals who can share this
Mhm.
with us. And in this case, these individuals have gone on, but they left
Mhm.
this very valuable information and history with us. So primary sources we're talking about. So
And if you can't make it to archive, you can look at The Fire of Freedom by David Soselsky, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs with the pseudonym Linda Brent, and David Walker's Appeal in 4 parts
yes,
to the colored citizens of the world,
but in particularly and very expressly to those of the United States of America.
and expressly to those of the United States of America. So those are 3 publications that you can still get your hands on in your public library, as well as through, I'm not doing a shout out to Amazon, but you can get it on Amazon or at your local bookstore to read about the lives of these individuals and what they produced. So with the time remaining, I want you to talk a little bit about Emancipation Day.
I want to, can you go back to the previous screen? Because as I mentioned at the outset, Emancipation Day predates Juneteenth.
Mhm.
It undergirds Juneteenth.
Mhm.
And essentially it's the same news of the spread of freedom for all.
Mhm.
It's just a different name out in Texas with a different date.
Mhm.
But it's essentially the same thing. So here's a primary source that I located in our state archives from the Chatham Record newspaper in Pittsboro, North Carolina.
Mhm.
And it says the first day of January is observed very differently nowadays from what it was before the Civil War. And the streets of our ancient borough, meaning the Chatham and Pittsboro, North Carolina, and Chatham County, was a present day different appearance. Before the Civil War and until the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 of the slaves, the 1st of January was the time when the quote slaves were hired out and sold at public auction.
Mhm.
That's what the point of Emancipation Day was, to juxtapose.
Mhm.
You and I will be sitting around on New Year's Day wondering if you're going to be sold, if I'm going to be sold, if our children are going to be sold, hired out,
Mhm.
we ever see each other again, certain uncertainty. but Emancipation Day flipped it on its head
Mhm.
and made it a day anticipating freedom,
That's right.
the first night watch. So many slaves in this county, meaning Chatham County, were hired by railroad contractors and turpentine operators that you see on the screen, turpentine contractors, who before the war was sent there and would go to the first day of every January and hire Negro men at the courthouse,
Mhm.
just like we talked about.
Mhm.
And so if you scroll on down, nowadays, the 1st of January is celebrated here, meaning in North Carolina, by the quote, colored people in grand style and combination and in consideration of their emancipation. For instance, our streets here in this case, Pittsburgh, North Carolina, last Thursday was a crowd of happy, well-dressed, orderly, quote, colored people who were presenting a striking contrast to those who were in slave days used to come up and be hired out and brought in chains to the courthouse. A complete difference.
Mhm.
A long procession of them paraded down the principal streets, in this case, again, Pittsburgh, North Carolina, and at its head proudly rode the gaily decorated marshals, and following them was a colored brass band. Exercises were held in the courthouse consisting of speeches, images, and music. Times have changed, 1903,
Amazing.
Chatham County.
Mm.
And this, again, primary sources is the only known photograph
Mhm.
that we have of Emancipation Day. And if you look closely, it says Aiken, South Carolina.
Mhm.
Now, based on that report that I just read in the Chatham Record of Pittsburgh, North Carolina, there's someone out there who's got to have photographs or some other images, primary sources, whether they're artifacts, documents, photographs, or oral history related to Emancipation Day in North Carolina. And when you do, call us here at the North Carolina Museum of History and we'll come and see you.
Wonderful. So we're wrapping up because we have a few more slides that we want to go through, a few more, I should say, content items we want to go through. But I have to stop and ask this question because I'm getting a few questions in the chat here. And this may be more of a theoretical or conspiracy sort of question, which I'm sure you have no problem diving into. But one of them was, do you think, and maybe I'm not reaching back and drawing any remembrance of reading anything that would suggest that Abraham Galloway and Harriet Tubman crossed paths. When we think about his travels during the Civil War, when we think about Tubman's travels during the Civil War, her raid in South Carolina, and her time in Maryland, and just the woman that she was. One of our amazing viewers has asked, do we think, or asked a question about whether or not Galloway and Tubman could have crossed paths?
I love that question. I got to tell you, Crystal, it's getting me lathered up because the both of them were spies.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
the chances of one spy knowing another,
It's pretty high.
but the chances of you knowing that they know each other is
Pretty
pretty
low.
low. So there is a research question is, let us find some primary sources if they did.
Mhm.
I would bet against it because had there been found some primary sources linking those two,
Mhm.
we might not know about either of them
Mhm.
because likely they would have been executed.
Mhm.
So that question is a very good question from the chat, but the short answer is likely yes.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that's something that we can all, for those of us who like to romanticize and think about the possibilities, and I don't mean romanticize in a slighting way, but the possibilities. And I think back to my time as a social studies teacher, as a history teacher. My students would say, "Do you think Harriet Tubman had to send somebody upward with her shotgun?"
Well, she probably
Probability.
read David Walker's Appeal.
The probability is what?
Let me tell you, there's a story in David Walker's Appeal that
Mhm.
alludes to just that.
Mhm.
There was a story about a couple, he talks about being chained and taken out, and they had worked themselves out of the
Chains. Mhm.
and got away, only to get away. And one person in the slave chain who had been chained
Mhm.
came back to the slaver
Mhm.
and told them where the others were.
Yes,
This is an appeal to the colored
citizens of the world.
Right, or in other words, that would have been named something else during that time frame.
Absolutely.
So the question is, did Harriet Tubman have to use that pistol?
The probability, I keep
I would say
reading,
very
is
high, very high. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And so yes, we want to continue to have these conversations about North Carolina revolutionaries and the role they played in liberation. We want to invite people to look at their literary work, what they had to say that is in print, that is still is a blessing with us, and study it and think about the components of their works that are applicable to the struggles that we have today. Because liberation is an ongoing thing.
It is.
It's an ongoing
and
thing.
attaining that ideal of freedom that's enshrined, freedom for all that's enshrined, it's a continuous work toward that more perfect union.
Absolutely. So as we wrap this up, because we're looking at about 10 minutes after 8, that went by pretty fast. We want to talk briefly about some upcoming events here at the North Carolina Museum of History and through the Capital City Juneteenth celebrations. We do have, and when we talk about liberation, we're talking about even in modern times. So we're going to talk about a couple of programs that are coming up that may not speak to Juneteenth in terms of 1865 in Texas, but speak to Juneteenth in terms of liberation and freedom from all, and freedom for all, and the continuous struggle. So we have a Pauli Murray event. For those of you who are following the North Carolina Museum of History, we have a Pauli Murray viewing, a documentary coming up this Thursday night. Feel free to register on our website and join us here at the North Carolina Museum of History on Thursday night. We also have, and I want to move to this one next, an event coming up on the 17th.
On the 17th, between 1 and 4 p.m., we're going to have reenactors, United States Colored Troop reenactors here
Yes,
at the
and the
North
next
Carolina Museum of
slide,
History, as well as the world famous basket maker, Mr. Neil Thomas, who is the last known split oak basket maker in North Carolina, possibly in the South.
Mhm.
And we're fortunate enough to have his artifacts, his baskets in our collection, and he'll be here doing a live demonstration and the film and offering his prize baskets for sale.
Mhm.
And then at 7 p.m. that night, we're going to have the in-person world screening premiere of Searching for Freedom, George Henry White, who is, or who was, the last Black congressman during the Reconstruction era from North Carolina. We briefly alluded to him introducing anti-lynching bills in the 1890s that were never heard. And of course, he is the subject of PBS's latest film, which will be released on Juneteenth worldwide, that June 18th, the Saturday. But come to the North Carolina Museum of History, Daniels Auditorium, 7 p.m. at Friday, June 17th, and you'll get a sneak preview for free.
And on that note, we'd like to just give you a sneak peek. This will take about 2 minutes regarding George White.
I believe that George Henry White is one of the most understudied and underappreciated political figures in United States history. He understood Black aspiration because he understood it because he had lived it.
He is always, in his darkest moment, he's an optimist.
You can do it.
George H. White created this community as a way to bring his own people to create group economics, which means that you can do business with yourself.
Congressman White foresaw literally what came to being in the latter part of the 20th century.
I think that was what President Obama tapped into when he talked about it in 2009.
At the end of an inspiring farewell address, the gentleman from North Carolina said, "This, Mr. Chairman, is perhaps the Negro's temporary farewell to the American Congress. But let me say, Phoenix-like, he will rise up someday and come again."
He uses his last address in Congress to remind his fellow
So thank you all so much for joining us tonight. We are excited about this launch of the Capital City Juneteenth programs. We ask that you look at our website for more information about Juneteenth programs and look at our website for the programs that we have this week. In addition to the Pauli Murray program on June 16th, we have the George White program on June 17th. And I'll let Earl talk just a moment about a program we have coming up on June 23rd, the Royal Ice Cream Program. Earl, can you talk a little bit about that?
That is, and quickly, the Juneteenth at historic Dix Park, Dorothea Dix Park, so come out for that between 1 and
Yes.
6.
Mhm.
But on June 23rd, we are celebrating the 65th anniversary and commemoration of the Royal Ice Cream Sit-In, or the first stage sit-in in North Carolina history. And the Royal Seven were 7 high school graduates
Mhm.
who went to Durham to enjoy ice cream on a 105-degree day in June. Imagine that. And want ice cream, and to be arrested for going in the front door and getting ice cream.
Mhm.
And so they unwittingly became the first sit-in. And unfortunately, they have all passed on except for 2.
Mhm.
And here at the museum, we're going to have the last 2, Dr. Mary Clyburn Hooks and Dr. Virginia Williams, both here, both together, and both for the first time telling their story and giving us a primary resource.
Amazing. So we want you to join us virtually for that program on June 23rd. And I want to say thank you, Earl. I want to say
You're welcome.
thank you to the amazing staff here at the North Carolina Museum of History. Miss Michelle Carr, thank you so much for managing our chat. Joel Rhodes, thank you so much for all of your technical expertise and assistance. And to you, Earl, this has been an amazing, sort of
thank you.
event. I'm excited that we will continue to do this as the years progress. This being our second
Yes.
Juneteenth sort of program that we're planning. And I would ask all of you to continue to look to the North Carolina Museum of History for your historical and entertainment needs. Thank you for joining us tonight. Look to our website, and we appreciate all of you.
Well, thank you, Crystal, and your staff.
Good night.